Welcome back to another episode of the Two Christian Dudes podcast. We're doing kind of a hybrid episode. I think we'll end up using this on the Sean Tabbitt Show. We'll probably use it for one of Randy's Heaven broadcasts as well. We have a real treat for you today. We're going to be talking to Dr. Eben Alexander, who has had his own near-death experience and has shared his thoughts on his experiences across several books. We've been looking forward to this broadcast for a long time, and so we're going to jump right in. Randy, I'm going to pitch to you, my friend. Take us into the episode.
Well, Dr. Alexander, it is a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, Randy, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you guys.
Well, likewise. And you actually personally gave me encouragement to share my story publicly as well, because I think with your book that came out, Proof of Heaven, which was a New York Times bestseller in 2012. And I remember seeing that on the shelf, and it was in all of the bookstores, and it was very popular and still is to this day. But you've also authored some other books. Your most recent book is Living in a Mindful Universe. And then you've also written a book called The Map of Heaven, which is very intriguing. But I think what sets you apart from many is that you are also a neurosurgeon. So when you had your experience and you contracted bacterial meningitis, which infected your brain, and then you went into a deep coma, and I think that was in 2008, you had an experience at the time that really kind of blew away, if you will, your common thinking as a neurosurgeon, as a scientist, because you were also a teacher at Harvard Medical School. So you were thinking in terms of the physical realm. And then, of course, you were learned in quantum mechanics and all of the more ethereal physics portions or parts of the mind, and the afterlife was not something that was very relevant. I mean, apart from the physical explanation, was it?
Well, before my coma, I was a card-toting, reductive materialist neuroscientist. And the general rule there is physicalism or materialism, that only the material world exists, and therefore the brain must somehow create consciousness out of physical matter alone, and that's all there is to the story. And I fully believe that. Now, at the time, nobody had the remotest clue how to even start that argument. They just thought, well, it's got to be, because we think the physical world is all there is, and therefore somehow we can explain all this. We just need to know more. It was called promissory materialism. But the fact of the matter is everything has evolved in the study of consciousness, especially in the last 10 or 20 years. I think it's become very clear to most people who study it deeply that consciousness is this profound mystery, and the brain is not a producer of consciousness at all. It's clearly related to consciousness, but that relationship of one is of serving more as a filter, which really means that when your brain and body die, your soul, your kind of conscious essence, is liberated to a higher level of awareness. So anybody, a materialist would think, well, when you die, your brain, all chemical reactions, electron flux is shut down. And so then your awareness dims down to nothing. It's the exact opposite of that. And not only that, but we have these expansive journeys that people have where they realize the connectedness we all share. They re-encounter souls of departed loved ones. And this is not just imagination. It's absolutely real. When you study hundreds and thousands of these cases, you realize there's a tremendous amount of evidence supporting the ongoing reality of the soul after bodily death. Now, there is one other part that I think is important to mention from a scientific perspective, and I think for some in traditional Christianity, they struggle a teeny bit with this, and it's the whole notion of reincarnation. But the reality is some of the strongest scientific evidence we have for the eternity of soul and for this connectedness of souls really comes from the scientific literature on reincarnation. And it doesn't take away in any fashion the deep and profound messages of Christianity and other great faiths about the afterlife and about our oneness, how we're bound through love and all of that. It simply expands our mission into a much greater universe where, in fact, our souls continue in these incarnations, coming back in this process of refinement and grace. So it's not really the notion out of, say, some religious traditions. Some people would interpret Buddhism as saying reincarnation is there, but that the whole goal is to get off that cycle of reincarnation. But in fact, as we explain in the map of heaven, I think pretty extensively, this is really all about grace. It's about a connection with God, an understanding of a loving, infinitely powerful and knowing, but also a God that loves us so much as to allow us to express free will. And that free will is, I think, the whole reason the universe exists, is so that we can make our choices and live these lives. But it's all done in a process of refinement and ascension towards that oneness with the divine over multiple lifetimes. So for me, it's just greatly expanded, the scientific study of consciousness and all these different avenues has greatly expanded my understanding of the universe and of the real power of that infinitely loving deity, that God at the very core of it all, that is really at the source of our very conscious awareness, never anywhere distant from us at all. I try to make that point in Proof of Heaven, that God is deeply personal. In fact, our very conscious awareness is sourced perfectly in that infinitely loving God. But we're here to make these choices. And the more we come to realize, and I think one of the fundamental lessons of NDEs is the power of love, the binding force of love. That was probably the main lesson that Jesus of Nazareth brought to this world, was that God is within us and that we're bound together through a force of love because God is love. And I would say that the modern NDE community, no matter what your faith base, you listen to the words and hear how people rise above the superficial distinctions between various religions and start to converge on the center of oneness, of love, of mercy, compassion, kindness, that we're all truly in this together. And really, I would say the life review, which is occurs in 25 to 50% of NDEs, is one of the most beautiful examples of how we're really all sharing the dream of that one mind, of that God force mind, and are truly in this together. Because in a life review, people often describe that they witness kind of their life actions, but not from their perspective, but from the perspective of those around them who were affected, influenced by their actions and thoughts. And so the life review in many ways shows us that we're truly one. And these boundaries of self that we maintain when we're in these bodies, living these lives, in many ways is a kind of a cover for a deeper and more profound truth that is revealed when we leave the physical body once and for all, but also, of course, is revealed in near-death experiences, because in those cases, people come back. But they're very similar experiences to what, for example, Christopher Kerr, in his recent book, Death is But a Dream, makes very clear is present throughout the hospice movement, the terminal patient care movement. You always find these same principles and themes, and you always find love is so important there. And that, in fact, in those dying episodes that Christopher Kerr describes, people come into this tremendous sense of love, especially when souls of departed loved ones return to help escort them over. So to me, this scientific study of NDEs and of consciousness in the modern era is tremendously refreshing and liberating.
Well, it's said that the most revolutionary concept that Jesus brought was returning evil with good, that is, with love. And I think that before that, the traditional practice was an eye for an eye. So that was a very revolutionary concept that he had. You had in your own experience, Dr. Alexander, kind of a dichotomy of experiences initially when you fell into a deep coma, and yours was meningitis, that E. coli, as I believe it was, which is generally an infection that I believe that children realize and not adults. But then you had this juxtaposition between where you were initially and then where you found yourself in this paradise. So tell us a little bit about that dichotomy and why you think there was this stark contrast between the two.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, my journey, I would say, for one thing, it's important to point out to people, near-death experiences have a tremendous amount of commonalities that suggest a common realm and common journey. And that goes across cultures, continents, millennia, what have you. There's a tremendous convergence of kind of theme of how these things unfold. But everyone is tailored for the individual soul. That's why every NDE has these different elements. And there was one kind of major feature of my NDE that was different from others. And that was that I was amnesic, that I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. I had no knowledge of Earth, of humans, of this universe. I really started out with an empty slate. And I think that was absolutely crucial. And I can see, especially in retrospect, if it had unfolded without that, I would have been more tempted, in spite of the fact that I had a 1 in a million diagnosis and a 1 in a billion recovery. I might have been more tempted, for example, if my guardian angel had been my father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma. He was a neurosurgeon. He was tremendously influential in my life, just an absolutely wonderful soul. And he is who I would have scripted into that position if I'd thought you can script an NDE and have it follow your lead. Well, that's not what happened. I had this this beautiful woman on the butterfly wing who is my guardian angel, who gave me tremendous reassurance through this journey. And it was really her identity much later, 4 months after my coma, that helped me put it all together. But that's why I think that amnesia was so important. I really had to go in with a completely empty slate to have this extraordinary set of events that I describe in Proof of Heaven unfold. And that's what really gave me the evidence when I came back that it was absolutely real. It seemed way too real to be real, as I told my older son, majoring in neuroscience at the time. I mean, to me, and my doctors, remember that this amnesia lasted after I came back to this world. In fact, the amnesia was so severe when I woke up from coma on day 7. All I knew is where I'd just been. And there is my family at my bedside, my mother, my sisters, former spouse, my sons. I had no idea who they were. And it was, but those personal memories and language all came back within hours and days. All my semantic knowledge of neurosurgery, physics, cosmology came back over about 2 months. But that was an extraordinary period of return of memory. The other thing it showed me, of course, is that memories are not stored in the brain at all. And scientists have suspected that for a long time, but it is such a fatal nail in the coffin of materialist science, neuroscience. When you say, well, guess what? Memories are not stored in the brain, it's one of the last things to be let go of by the materialist neuroscientific community. But it's crystal clear that our brain serves as a transceiver, as a mechanism of accessing that God force, that mental layer of the universe, but it doesn't create it. It's simply a filter. But kind of getting back to your question, my journey very briefly, in the NDE, it started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive course on responsive realm. And if my journey had ended there, I would have had a hellish NDE. About 3 to 5% of NDEs are described as disturbing or difficult. And don't misunderstand that. They're still very transformative in a positive way. Just that I think some people, especially if they've been very greedy or selfish, they can have a life review that can be, unpleasant because of the way they've treated other people. That's one cause of kind of the hellish NDE. I think there are other causes too. It has to do with various aspects of a soul's journey. But anyway, it didn't end there. I ascended up through this brilliant portal of light that was associated with music, perfect musical melody. It led me into what I call the Gateway Valley, which had a lot of Earth-like features, but it was like Plato's world of ideals. It was a perfect realm. There was no sign of any death or decay. I remember all this lush plant life down below this meadow and surrounding forests, and there were thousands of beings in simple garb, dancing, joy, and merriment everywhere. Incredible festivities. And it was being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of light, angelic choirs emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And that is what actually then allowed me to ascend to higher and higher levels. Now, I've already mentioned that in that Gateway Valley, with the Earth-like features, with all this festivity going below, the dancing and merriment, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. millions of other butterflies, and I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me. She was my spiritual guide. And of course, it was her identity that I discovered 4 months post-coma, because her visual memory was burned into me, and her emotional truth, that what she said to me, she didn't say a word, but it came telepathically. This beautiful message: you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for. And another thing in Proof of Heaven that I mentioned at that time as her message was, you can do no wrong. And that statement, the way I put it in Proof of Heaven, people misunderstand. Because I knew in the light of that realm, in the love of that God, and in that force of all the beauty I was witnessing, what you can do no wrong means is that we go towards that light. And the more we evolve as spiritual beings, the more we come close to that God of love and compassion and mercy and kindness. And so life is really an adventure of having free will, because God loves us so much as to give us that free will, but allows us that freedom of choice. And that's where this all becomes very beautiful, because we can make the choices we want to make, but we will face repercussions. We have responsibility for our choices. The more they hew closely to that notion of love for others, for compassion, for taking care of the least, the last, and the lost, for really caring for all of our fellow beings, the more direct is our pathway towards ascendance in that mode. But we have the freedom to choose otherwise. And if we do so, we simply learn, either in this life or in that life review. As I said, if you've been treating others poorly through your life review is not going to be a lot of fun, because you'll be on the receiving end of all that. And that's where all of this works to help nudge us more towards who we came here to be as spiritual beings. Now, just to finish off this little description of my journey, important to say that Gateway Valley was a gateway. It wasn't my final destination. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of that spiritual realm of the Gateway Valley, which includes a different ordering of causality that I call deep time. And deep time is kind of that outer objective view of our lives, where we can see our whole life in a life review, because we're no longer constrained by the confines of what we view as earth time, which is part of the fiction. It's part of what allows us to understand it and live these lives. But ultimately, there's what I call deep time, which is that ordering of progression of souls and advance of souls, soul growth through multiple incarnations. And also, deep time allows the measurement of assessing the transformation or evolution of consciousness itself. Like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin mentioned in his book, Phenomenon of Man, that's actually what's going on here, is this evolution. And so in the next level of my journey, what I call the core, which was kind of my ultimate destination in my NDE, coming into the presence of that infinitely loving God force, becoming one with the God force. And that's where there was a beautiful orb, brighter than a million stars, that I saw as this translator, interpreter, that kind of helped me to navigate this core realm, but ultimately in that realm becoming one with all, where all dualities are resolved, masculine, feminine, good, bad, dark, light. Every bit of duality becomes resolved into oneness in that God realm, as we recognize that oneness with the divine. And then I would tumble back down to that earthworm's eye view. So I cycled through these realms several times during the journey. And I think that was a tremendous lesson in itself, that I had this variability. I never felt during that part of the journey, though, that my free will was determining I will next go to this level, next go to that level. And I never could really explain why I would tumble back down. But it all provided these incredible lessons. For one, that music, vibration, frequency is what we can use as souls to navigate those spiritual journeys. Just as chants and anthems and hymns can help engender a deep transcendental state here in the earthly realm. Likewise, music, vibration, frequency, and of course there, in the ideal form, it goes far beyond anything you could ever construct in our four-dimensional space-time. And the music is far more beautiful in its ideal form. And yet it is a tool. And that is what we can use in meditation. That's what we can use as spirits traversing these realms, is this notion of vibration and frequency to traverse them. And there came a point at the end of these multiple traversals, after many lessons and things that I've tried to unpack through meditation and centering prayer in the decade plus since my coma, was a tremendous kind of body of knowledge, of understanding of how all this works. But basically, it's very simple. We are one with the divine. We are yearning to become more one with the divine through living our lives. And we have great responsibility for our choices to take care of ourselves and take care of each other.
Well, Randy, if you don't mind, I'll jump in and ask a question. We didn't talk about it ahead of time, how we were going to go back and forth. So I'll assume the pattern is per normal.
I think it's almost intuitive now, Sean.
Yes, it's ingrained. One of the things that struck me about your story, Dr. Alexander, is you were told early on that you weren't going to be staying. Many of the folks we've talked to, they don't want to leave their heaven experience. They're sad if they're told that they're going to be going back. Some people have even been given a choice. Talk to us a little bit about at what point you were aware that you weren't staying in this heaven experience.
Well, I'd come to believe, as cycling through those three levels multiple times, I'd come to believe you're not here to stay in the core simply meant fine. So I go back down to the earthworm's eye view. I had learned that by remembering the musical notes of the melody and repeating them in my mind, that would conjure up that light portal, that kind of wormhole that led me up into the Gateway Valley. So just knowing the music that I'd heard the first time around and remembering it allowed me to traverse back into that. So I was not worried about this, you're not here to stay in the core, because I knew that these realms were just incredible for lessons and understanding and learning. But I had not yet glimpsed that there was that earthly realm that I would actually go back to as a soul. And that's what was in the process of occurring. And I remember towards the end of my NDE, when I finally tried to conjure up that portal out of the earthworm eye view, and it didn't happen, I realize now, okay, they weren't kidding. I'm not there to stay. I'm going back. But what in the world does all this mean? And where am I headed? And that is when I had this vision I describe in Proof of Heaven of the thousands of beings going off into the mists around me. And many of them were with heads bowed and arms up like this. Some had hoods, some were holding candles. And there was this murmuring energy coming from them. And the thing that amazed me so much was, even though I was down in that murky earthworm eye view, which had originally seemed such a foreboding realm, now with this energy coming from all these beings, it elevated me. It was filled with love and kindness, compassion, connection. And it was very reassuring. And it was then in that environment that I then saw 6 faces that bubbled up out of the muck. And they were very, very important because they were the faces of people who were, 5 of them were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of my coma. So they provided what's called a veridical time anchor to show me that the vast majority of the coma had to happen between days 1 and 5, when in fact, as a review of my medical records, and there's a medical case report by Dr. Bruce Grayson and Serbi Khanna and Lauren Moore that came out in September 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And people can get to that case report on my website, ebenalexander.com, in the blog posting for September 2018. In the 3rd paragraph, there's a link right to it. But the medical case report makes it very clear that my survival and recovery from this is extraordinary. It's a medical miracle. And the way they explained it when the reviewing doctor, the peer reviewers at the journal asked him, how do you explain this case? Nobody we know of has ever been this sick from meningoencephalitis with E. coli and then had a full recovery after a week in coma. And they said it's because he had the NDE that he was able to have that kind of miraculous recovery. So it's no longer a miracle. It's just an expectation of having that spiritual connection. And that's where all this, I think, gains so much power. And so for me, at the very end there, with those 6 faces, one of them, the last one I remember seeing, was a young boy. And of course, this was day 7 of coma. The doctors had just held a conference with my family saying it was time to let me go, to stop the antibiotics, that I'd started the week with a 10% chance of survival, but I was now down to 2% with no chance of recovery. So they recommended just letting me go. And my son Bond, 10 years old at the time, was just outside the door, overheard all that. And he knew that was horrible news. So they tried to protect him from the worst news all week. He came running down the hall into Major Bay 10 in that ICU. He pulled open my eyelids. I was there on a ventilator. I'd been on a ventilator for 7 days now. One eye looking over there, one eye down there, neither pupil responsive. Those people in medicine will know that's a horrible, horrible picture. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes. I did not hear him with my ears, but he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. As if somehow that would make it so. And even though I didn't understand the words, he was the sixth face that I saw in that vision at the very end. And he was the reason I had to come back. His name is Bond. That's an amazingly great name, for someone who bonded me to this world and brought me back to this reality. And even though I didn't recognize him as my son, I had no idea who this was. I didn't even know what a son was in that sense, but he was pleading with me. I knew I had to do something. And I didn't understand the rules of this place. So far, the entire journey for the week, I'd had no fear, because I had no memory, and therefore I didn't know things could be any better than any of this. And of course, there had been the extraordinary beauty of the journey in the gateway and in the core realm, just extraordinary, just beyond description. The love, the compassion, boiling in that ocean of love, that incredible sense, bathing, I should say, just an incredible sense. And yet now here was this need to come back to another realm that to me was still quite a mystery. But that's why I came back to this world, was a sense of responsibility for Bond. And of course, I've come to realize that there's much more to my coming back to this world, but that was in the moment of the NDE itself. That was the reason for my return.
Hey, Randy, I'd like to pull on the thread of the six faces for just a moment more, if you don't mind. I recently did an interview about people traveling in the spirit, and so the additional face of somebody who wasn't in your ICU room, that stuck out to me in your story. Tell us a little bit about your friend Susan also being one of the faces you encountered. That's a unique element to your story. I don't think we've had this in an NDE before.
That's an absolutely beautiful part of the story. And a little backstory is I first met Susan Renches in freshman English class at UNC in 1972. So that's how far back we went. Although we were friends then, we knew each other in early college, but then our pathways split for a long time until more into the 80s, when I was married at the time, and my former spouse was teaching in Raleigh, and she co-taught with Susan. They got to be very good friends. Now, it turns out, though, that Susan had a lot of channeling experiences when she was young. She'd have these profound experiences of connections with others through the mental space, the kind of thing that before my coma, I would have said, channeling, that's nonsense. Don't talk to me about that. Well, guess what? Susan showed me channeling's very real, because deep in my coma, one of the faces was Susan. And it turns out, I found out in the days after I came back to this world, that Susan had written a book called Third Eye Open. It was about her channeling experiences. And in that book, she talked about helping people who were in deep, trouble medically, and a lot of them were coma patients. And she would go into this meditative trance state, and she would communicate with them, and she would try and usher them in the right direction to help them come into healing. And that's exactly what she did with me. It turns out, when I was deep in coma, not only was my former spouse Holly there at my bedside, but also her very close friend Sylvia White. And she was the one who also knew Susan from those teaching days and said, we should call Susan and see if she can help out. So they called her up, and on Thursday and Friday night, that would have been fourth and fifth nights of my coma, Susan would trance travel to me from her home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 120 or some miles, to Lynchburg, Virginia, where I was deep in coma. And I remember her coming in and just having this beautiful kind of sense of connection with her, even though I didn't remember the specifics of the connection, but this beautiful sense of her presence, knowing her, trusting her. And she gave my family and friends mantras to chant through the evening to help return me to home. And she helped me there too. And she did it those 2 nights. And I remember that very vividly but it was all at the very end of the coma experience. So most of the coma that's important was between days 1 and 5, I would say, even though potentially even day 4, because I'm not sure how much that appearance of Susan in the trance form was remembered by me. But anyway, yeah, it was a fascinating part. And then, of course, when I was waking up, and by then, of course, when I saw these people at the very end of my coma, I didn't know who they were. And they would say these words and their mouth would move. It was like those old Charlie Brown Christmas cartoons where the adults talk and it's like, wah, 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 wah. And that's exactly what this was like for me, was these faces would come out of the muck and say these words I couldn't understand. That was the same kind of thing that Bond was to me, these words, these pleading, but I didn't understand the words themselves. But anyway, it was just an extraordinary part of the experience that Susan, as they told me this, I said, well, in the hours after waking up, I said, well, you were there and you were there and you were, and Susan Riches was there too. And they said, well, Susan was not here physically, but she did channel to you those 2 nights. And of course, by then I knew, well, physical boundaries don't exist in the spiritual realm. So of course she was right there with me. No surprise. And of course, Susan and I have presented several times on this, and she's just a absolutely wonderful soul. But she was a huge part of my awakening by being there and by helping for me to find my own way back to this realm.
I'm struck by, and that, those are amazing stories, and I'm struck by just the dichotomy between the scientific mindset that you had going into this, and obviously still maintain. You had talked about the neocortex being what makes humans special,
right?
And so, as a neurologist, your thinking obviously was tailored to the physical nature of the brain.
Right.
How would you explain, Dr. Alexander, your kind of spiritual state of mind going into this? Did you have one? And then obviously coming out of this, was there an epiphany based on your experience that now the spiritual realm was as real, if not more real than the physical?
Yes. Well, there was an extraordinary shift, 180-degree flip in my understanding from materialism really to idealism. I went all the way to the other end, to realizing the mental layer of the universe as it governs everything that unfolds in the physical world. And given that none of us has ever known anything outside of our own consciousness, it's really the inside of our own consciousness. We assume there's a world out there, a physical world that is independent of us. But quantum physics is crystal clear on the point, no. Everything that you witness in the world deeply depends on you. It's all, there's this tremendous sense of the importance of subjectivity. And in fact, in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we talk about how you can never really argue there's any such thing as objectivity, given that all of us are completely contained within our world of consciousness. And quantum physics says it very clearly that there is not an external physical world out there unfolding. That's why so many quantum physicists, in trying to explain the measurement paradox, resort to infinite parallel universes. That's the only way they can explain it. They can't explain it in one apparent universe. But when you realize consciousness is primordial, then it starts to make much more sense that, this is all about mind. And that was an extraordinary revelation for me. And yet I came to realize in the months after my coma, and especially the first few years, that there are hundreds of scientists around the world who've been working on this mystery for decades, if not centuries, really. And they're all converging in the same direction, which is the primacy of mind. It's a difficult one for some people to accept, and yet it fits the data better than anything. And it's very kind of promising for us because it shows the importance of free will. Remember that the materialist science that I worshiped before my coma, and I do not use that term lightly, but that materialist science would scoff at your very concepts of free will. If it's all chemical reactions and electron fluxes of stuff in the brain following the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, where would you ever put in any kind of free will? There is no such thing. Well, my journey showed me just the opposite. And that's why this is so important for our world, to see this revolution of going from materialism across all the dualisms straight into the world of idealism. I think ultimately that's going to be the best answer philosophically to explain the world. And it's very good news for all of us, because what it does is it starts to really put the emphasis on our power of free will to live the world of our dreams. And this is where it's so, so crucial to break away from the old insanity, the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism is not something we are forced to live with. And by acknowledging our spiritual nature in a spiritual universe, which is exactly where quantum physics, all the parapsychological evidence of non-local consciousness, aspects of philosophy of mind, as well as the hard problem of consciousness, they all put us in the same ballpark of having to reject materialism as a false worldview. And in fact, I would tell you, scientific materialism died 80 years ago with the advent of quantum physics. It's just that a lot of scientists have not yet read the obituary, but it's crystal clear. If you follow the science of consciousness as it's evolving now, is it fully enables this much richer vision of mind over matter, and that we're united in mind. Mind is not some accidental little thing that emerges from 3.5 pounds of gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath between my ears. But consciousness is the awareness of the universe, and it's something that sentient beings get to share with the universe. That's the real magic of this. But it also brings great power to us in our abilities to heal. I mean, medical science has been amazed by placebo effect for more than 6 decades. You know, it's the gold standard whenever we look at any new medical treatment to assess it. And if you ask Big Pharma, they hate placebo effect because they know that our thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes have a tremendous role in healing. In fact, when you study it more and more deeply, you start to wonder if those other substances and medicines we take are actually having any real effect. Now, I think they do, but it's an interplay. But there's a very important effect of our free will. And so placebo effect gives you about a 30% benefit right out of the gate. And it's not just about fixing a headache with a sugar pill. If you go to noetic.org, Institute of Noetic Sciences website, put in spontaneous remission as a search term, you'll find a book they put out in the mid-90s with more than 3,500 cases of people with healing like mine, beyond any possible medical explanation, from cancer, infections, what have you. And people who have assessed that database have come up with many different features that allow those people to heal themselves. But as you can imagine, they're mainly spiritual. They have to do with acknowledging a spiritual nature, having a purpose in life, supporting positive emotions about self and relationships with others, processing the negative emotions, all these things that have to do with the mental and the spiritual that can bring us into wholeness, into healing, into being the souls we came here to be. But that inevitably involves a higher sense of love, compassion, kindness, caring for others, and realizing that the best way that we can be loved by the universe and express this profound love that the universe has for us, that we can find in meditation, centering prayer, or in events of our lives, is through serving as a conduit to allow that love to come through us and share it with our fellow beings. And this is why I think this revolution in understanding is so critical, because that false sense of separation engendered by materialist science is extremely misleading and takes you away from the oneness of the universe that is so apparent in these kind of experiences, but also comes up naturally in something like quantum physics, where you start to understand there's one mind and one consciousness, and we're really all sharing that. So that if you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. And that's why to help another is to help yourself. And we really need to shift the focus of our modern society and culture and politics and economics and judicial system and every bit of that to reflect this and to start to grow into those higher souls we came here to be.
I have a question about any personality shift or change. One of the things that we've seen with so many of the men and women we've talked to, they're so profoundly marked by their experience. A lot of them report feeling like they were just saturated in love in the environment of what they experienced. I'm curious for you on this side of your journey, as you look back, are there any specific things that really have shifted in your personality?
Well, I remember my That question was when I went to the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies to present my story officially, exactly 2 years to the hour after I woke up from coma. I took my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience, then went to medical school in osteopathy. And but anyway, when Bruce Grayson asked him, "Has your father changed at all?" Eben said, "Well, he's a lot nicer." Well, I think I was a pretty nice guy before, but the reality is it's a complete flip. I mean, you end up seeing yourself and your relationship with everyone else and just your daily purpose shifting dramatically. It's one of the reasons I often say that the most important lesson to come from near-death experiences is not what happens when we die, but far more important is what they teach us about how do I make choices in living my life today. Every choice I have about how I deal with myself, how I view myself, how I deal with others, how I treat them. When you see us all as sharing the dream of the one mind of that God force, and you see everyone trying to do their best, and you realize that love has the power to overwhelm any of the kind of hatred and violence and conflict and manipulation that we see in our society, this incredible sense of love. I mean, this is an ancient lesson. I mean, you don't have to buy into any particular religious system, but certainly Jesus of Nazareth was probably the major early proponent of this incredible force of love. And that is something that near-death experiencers, no matter what their religious belief system, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, Baha'i faith, I mean, all of them can have a very similar experience. And to me, what it points out is that I came back realizing that whether I call that deity, that infinitely loving and comforting force that I encountered in the core, God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, I don't care what you call it. But in many ways, as Descartes said, to define is to limit. And so when we try and label all these things, we might be missing a deeper, profound truth about a unification of religions around love and compassion and kindness and mercy and caring for each other. That I think is really at the core. I think all major faiths have some version of the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And in fact, non-religious ethical systems often use the golden rule. But in many ways, I would say that the golden rule is written into the fabric of the universe in the form of the life review. That's where, as we said, thousands of years across all cultures, et cetera, life reviews have a tremendous commonality of showing us that we're in this together and that we're one with that God force. That's why people can bathe in that ocean of love so deeply on an NDE and come back transformed by that experience because it is so powerful and it's right at the essence of who we are. But this is why sharing this lesson with the world is so important. And Ken Ring, who's one of the founding fathers of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS.org, and I would encourage people to visit that website. But he wrote 30 years ago about how when people just know about NDEs and hear about them, read about them, all of the goodness of NDEs rubs off on those other people, and it helps them too. So you don't have to have an NDE just to know about this, to understand that people can have this extraordinary healing coming into wholeness, love, and well-being through an NDE should help all of us to realize that the deep spiritual lessons can be very important because that is really what is necessary to gain those tremendous benefits. And those lessons are available to all of us simply by becoming more aware of all of this. One other resource I'll point out in this discussion, it's a book that I often endorse, is called The Essence of Religions. It's by Robert Koppes, Koppes. And it's a fantastic book. He's the head of IONS in the Netherlands. And I wrote a foreword for the book. I highly recommend it. It basically discusses NDEs and how they inform our knowledge through the lens of 5 major religious systems, through Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. And so I think it's a very valuable book. And he basically says, religions do a pretty good job of coming close to this, But at the end of the day, the more they can just focus on the purity of love, compassion, kindness, and mercy, then they're truly converging on the hardcore, concrete truths that emerge from the NDE story and community.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because oftentimes people will say, and I ascribe to this as well, that relationship is paramount to religion. And I think religious practices, and I, having been a former agnostic, you know, I had tried to refute all of the major religions, basically. And what I discovered was the relationship portion of that with God was foremost, or needed to be foremost, because it seemed that the relationship aspect was being clouded by some of the more rote practices that were inherent in the religion itself. So I think, you know, our audience being largely comprised of those who ascribe to the Judeo-Christian belief, many of them have felt scorned through religious practices. And when they find that relationship with the God of love, as you said, which was described in the ancient writings, you know, of the Bible, and of course they see Jesus as having been really the breakthrough advocate in terms of returning love for evil, or, you know, those who are not practicing any form of love. So it's interesting you say that. This is because our audience hears, I believe, when they see that the essence of God being love, and the desire to engage one another with those loving practices, you know, that's something that we can share very well. But I've got to tell you this, Dr. Alexander, I've been in the clinical realm for much of my career, in cardiology and neurology as well. And so I've got to guess that you have not had the same level of receptivity in the scientific community globally that perhaps one might hope, because have you gotten pushback from others in the scientific community?
Let's put it this way. There was a little pushback, or has been a little pushback along the way, that generally came from people who didn't really know my story well enough. They, for example, Oliver Sacks and Sam Harris, some of them were responding to a Newsweek piece and not responding to Proof of Heaven itself. But, you know, the pushback was really from a big misunderstanding in many ways. And I would say the groundswell, the incredible, overwhelming response from scientists has been the thousands of physicians, nurses, physicists, engineers, scientists of all stripes who have contacted me, and with great gratitude for what I have brought to the table. Because for them, they knew there was something wrong with materialism. They felt there was a more spiritual aspect to life, and yet they weren't sure within the confines of the scientific literature in the current era how to make sense of that. And that what they saw was that I was pointing a very clear pathway forward. Now, it turns out that I work with scientists around the world on this. And in fact, if you go to GalileoCommission.org, for example, you'll find I'm on the advisory board there with more than 100 other scientists who've written. Harold Wallach wrote the manifesto on that website, GalileoCommission.org. I highly recommend people read it, but it's all about the evolving science of consciousness. This is big, powerful, fantastic, amazing news, because it has to do with resolution of the mystery of quantum physics, far deeper understanding of the mind-brain relationship and of human reality across the board. It's extraordinary. And so, and that group, Galileo Commission, now has more than 300 scientists who have signed on to support their manifesto. Now, there are other manifestos out there that are similar, that have been supported by hundreds of scientists. So in fact, the truth of the matter is I find far more support from the scientific community than these little pitches that say, this is nonsense, this is a hallucination. We know from science this can't happen. You were dreaming, But read the case report, read Proof of Heaven, understand the damage to my brain. That was not a brain that could have any detailed, rich, elaborate, incredibly interactive, set of elements like I experienced. That was the most real and profound experience of my life. And to pretend it was the chaotic, kind of accident of a few neurons that were remaining after this onslaught by the should have killed me bacterial meningoencephalitis is absolutely missing the rich essence of what so many of these stories are all about. That's why I think my particular story is so important to the scientific community, is because of the documented damage to my neocortex. I should not have come back from this according to the tenets of modern medicine. I should not have had any experience, much less the most extraordinary experience of my life, according to the tenets of modern science and neuroscience. And yet, there are many in the world of science who have moved far beyond those simplistic, false, and bleak kind of observations of materialist science. And that's where all this becomes very exciting. And as I often say, this is about a unification of science and spirituality, because ultimately where we're headed is this profound truth of understanding objective idealism and the mental layer of the universe, and how that is what rules the show, and not any bottom-up physical causality. And this is a very important lesson for all the world. It's really undeniable to those who study this. And in fact, when you go back to Jesus of Nazareth, when he was saying the kingdom of God lies within, all he was saying is objective idealism is the way this universe works. And he knew it. He lived it. He absolutely gigantically brought it to this world thousands of years ago. And only now, at the pinnacle of decades of hardcore work in quantum physics and neuroscience, trying to come to a deeper understanding, we find that he was absolutely right on the beam. And of course, NDEers will tell you across the board, across all cultures, that it really is all about love and that binding force of connection. And we're connected within that mental realm. And the more we come to understand that and live it, the better a world we will have for all.
I want to get in one more question here, Randy, before we wrap up. I want to make sure we bookend the story about you describe her as your guardian angel or the guide that you encountered in heaven. Tell us a little bit about how you found out who that was. Like, you didn't recognize the person, you didn't know the person, but later you found out that was somebody fairly significant for you.
Right. Well, that is really my favorite part of the story, because to me, that was the shocking kind of key that unlocked the entire story and revealed its reality and its essential nature in my soul journey and every bit of that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, because for those who have not read Proof of Heaven, it is an extraordinarily beautiful way to bring that book to an ending. But I'll briefly kind of answer your question by saying I was adopted. That's a huge part of my story. In fact, I think much of my life was this kind of struggle of whether or not I was worthy of love. I think that influenced my relationships with people, and I struggle with it a lot. I was given up by my mother when I was 11 days old, and my father, the neurosurgeon, told me, you cannot possibly remember anything that happened to you when you were just a few days or weeks old. And I know now that he was wrong, that I did remember it. And I remembered it deeply. It was a smoking crater at the core of my life that I didn't even deserve to exist. Now, of course, I was very blessed in my life. I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. I couldn't have, I'm not trying to cry any tears for poor little me about being given up by my mother at age 11 days. But I think it's important because all of us, in many ways, have a similar kind of sense of abandonment from coming into the physical world. We come in from the heavenly realms, from the realm of God and love. And then we have the forgetfulness. There's a program forgetting. We're not supposed to remember all that. And that's why in early childhood, memories of past lives and between lives are covered over. And that's for a purpose. We're to live these lives with kind of the knowledge of this life to learn these soul lessons in a very deep way. But to get back to your question, I was adopted. It was a huge part of my soul journey. And in fact, I had struggled with my kind of religious beliefs Early on in my life, I followed my father's lead. He was a neurosurgeon. He was very scientific. He was very religious. He had a strong belief in God. He had a little pocket Bible that I still have by my bed that he had in his pocket all during World War II through his service as a combat surgeon in the Army Air Force. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and then into Japan. I still have that little Bible. For him, Christ, God, prayer were beautiful. He used them all through his life. It never conflicted with his science. For me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I wanted to believe everything I'd learned in that Methodist church growing up, but I wanted it in a scientific way. I wanted to know it scientifically. And so through my neurosurgical career, I had many doubts. And I must say, I then went into a dark night of the soul. And I talk about this in Proof of Heaven. I mentioned how I was looking, had given up looking for my birth family. I had accepted it all just fine. And then in 2000, my older son, Eben IV, was doing a school project in family genealogy. And he said, "Dad, we have to find out more about your birth family." So I wrote another letter to the children's home. I hadn't done that in decades. And this was asking, is my mother out there? I thought she might be. And I got an answer back that shocked me no end. And that was, and I describe it all in the book, so you can read it there, but it was that my birth parents had gotten married and they had 3 children. So I had a full family out there. I'd always thought maybe I had a birth mother, but nothing else, but a full family out there. But the problem was they had lost their youngest daughter 2 years earlier, in 1998, and they were still grieving her loss. So the social worker, in telling me this story over the telephone, said, and they're grieving her loss, so it's not a good time to come back in their lives. Now, that was not true, but that was her quick, easy interpretation over a 2-minute phone call. And that sent me into a dark night of the soul for the next 8 years. I quit taking my kids to church, saying prayers with them at night. I would take them to church occasionally, Christmas, Easter, but I really fell away from my belief in God and in the power of love and all that. A year before my coma, things unfolded where I then did meet my birth family, October 5th, 2007, an extraordinary event in its own right. But that was all just setting the stage for my NDE, because it was a year later that I went into coma. And that's where I encountered that beautiful guardian angel. And I won't say any more right now, but you've hit the nail on the head. That to me was absolutely astonishing. And her message to me, that deep empathic connection from her very refreshing and liberating message, "You're deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are cared for." And then to find out 4 months post-coma, when I saw that picture sent to me in the mail from my other birth sister, I just collapsed on the ground, on my knees, heart pounding, tears just pouring from my eyes. I couldn't stand up for more than half an hour. It was the most extraordinary, beautiful gift. It still brings tears to my eyes. And it was absolutely beautiful. And Betsy, I'm paying attention, Betsy. I get it now. So my guardian angel, doesn't even begin to do justice to the value and the power that she brought to my life. Thank you for bringing that up and for honoring her memory.
Wow. And thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing all of this that you have with us today, Dr. Alexander. I've so much wanted to talk with you. I know Sean shares that as well, for not just since the course of our doing this, but for years. And I wanted to leave you just with the opportunity for any parting words to our audience. I can tell you that we've received literally thousands of messages from individuals who have been blessed in hearing about near-death encounters, but they're also going through terrible struggles today. And, we have obviously much going on that is causing fear, and so some of them have lost loved ones. Some of them are struggling with cancer and other diseases, and some of them are very lonely. So I'll leave you with the last words before we close.
Well, I would simply say no soul left behind. Every one of us is important in this journey. As we've mentioned, the kingdom of God lies within. It's all about the mental. You can use centering prayer, meditation, My own personal use is something called sacred acoustics, which is a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And people who want to learn more about that can go to sacredacoustics.com. I use that an hour or two every day. For me, it's a tremendous blessing, but just know that going within and exploring consciousness and realizing that we're actually experiencing the consciousness of the universe, and we can use that to go out to influence others. That's why praying for others for health and healing can be so powerful. That's why Susan was able to get to me so easily, because we share one mind through that mental realm. And that was the same realm where I encountered an infinitely loving God force, as have countless other souls going back thousands of years. So it really, the power is within us all. I would advise people to take 10, 20 minutes a day, at least if they can, for prayer and meditation, to go within, to still that crazy little ego voice. I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in the head that so many of us identify with. He says it's that annoying roommate. That is it. Don't pay any attention to the ego voice, your little linguistic voice in your head, but go in and let that voice make an intention, state a request, but then that voice goes into timeout. And then just coast in the beauty of that loving presence. And if people use sacred acoustics, they'll see what I mean about just following with the music and being able to use that as a tool. But the essence is, whatever technique you have for turning off that little voice of ego and anxiety and of fear is a beautiful way to connect with the universe at large and find that God is absolutely within us all, that the power of love will heal us completely at all levels, whenever and wherever. Just remember to recover that love of the universe for self, and know that the best way to express that love is to share it, serve as a conduit, allow the love of God, the love of that deep inner well of well-being, let that come out through us, share that with others, and it just magnifies as we go. Just loving others is the best way to love self. And this will ultimately make the world a far better place. And in this world of COVID, economic challenge, immigrants being forced out of countries by warfare, et cetera. There's a tremendous amount of kind of carnage in this world, and yet it is all something we can deal with beautifully when we use the resources, the natural resources within of that God force of love, and sensing our connection with each other and with the universe at large, and all in service of a much greater purpose of unification and synthesis.
Thank you for that. So much that we can take with us and carry on as a tremendous word of encouragement. Sean, traditionally with Two Christian Dudes, you wrap it up and then we do the send off. I know we could go on for a long, long time with you, Dr. Alexander, but Sean, I'll let you wrap us up with this episode.
My pleasure. Well, and for all of you who have spent time with us today watching or listening to this broadcast, we really appreciate it. I know for some of you, this is going to encourage you. This is going to challenge you. So send us a note, leave us comments. We want to engage in discussion with what you encountered in this episode. And if you want to find out more about some of the people we talked to in our first season, we have about 12, 13 episodes with various folks who've had their own afterlife, near-death experiences. Be sure to go check those out. You may remember that we were going to be talking about unseen realm, kind of angels, demonic. We took a break from that over Christmas just because we've been crazy busy. We will get to those episodes, but we're going to insert this episode before those because this is such an important conversation that we've been looking forward to for some time. So anyways, thanks again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon on a future episode of Two Christian Dudes.
Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. And if you'd like further information, go to our website at randyk.org, where our mission is simple: to share the great news of God's love.